Something that really I don't think has been, brought out as well as it should. I mean, I think a lot of people stay away from the Old Testament because it's too difficult. There's things in there. Right? I mean, unfortunately, Andy Stanley has said, "Oh, we need to unhitch from the Old Testament." Well, that's not true. I mean, I'm sure his father Charles is not real happy with that statement. So today we're going to hear Tim Keller talking. He's got a series that he started now, little 10-minute clips. He's going through every book of the Bible and showing Jesus in it. And I thought, well, he's on Exodus right now, so we're going to watch his little 10-minute clip. It's kind of an overview and very insightful. I don't agree with everything Tim Keller says, but he's got a ministry, in the inner city that's very vibrant. He's got cancer right now, and I think it's a terminal case. So hopefully he'll get through 66. So let's see if I can get it going here. I don't think this is copyrighted, but we'll see.
Given after grace, even the law given only for relationship purposes, will never live up to it. Never. And therefore, unless the law, unless there's some way of paying for our sin, unless there's some way of atoning for our failures to obey the law, we are not going to be able to stay in a relationship with a holy God. Discovering the gospel in every book of the Bible. And today we're going to look briefly, concisely, I hope, as we always have been, at the book of Exodus. And each time we're going to be looking at the question, how does this book of the Bible move the storyline of the entire Bible along? Secondly, how does it give us some of the principles of the gospel of grace? And thirdly, how does it show us Jesus? So first of all, how does it move the storyline along? And as we've talked, we say that we say that the storyline of the Bible is creation, fall, redemption, and then restoration. But redemption is a very long chapter. And the redemption has a number of sub-chapters. And at first, God redeems through a family, the family of Abraham, which is what we saw in Genesis. But then in the book of Exodus, he moves that family into becoming a nation. And so the storyline moves along because in the book of Exodus, we see a family, the children of Abraham, and they still are a family in that sense, but they've gotten so large that they are to become a nation state, a culture, a nation with laws. And so that's a major way in which Exodus moves the storyline along. It's also true that for the first time we get the tabernacle, the temple, the sacrifices. And that, as we will see here in 1 second, also moves the storyline along because what God is doing here with the children, this family, the children of Israel, is he's not only giving them his law, but he's also showing them that the law won't be enough. So that moves us into principle, okay? The principle of the gospel is that we're saved by grace alone, but that grace always changes the life. So we're not saved by living a good life in any way. And yet once we grab that grace by faith, it changes our life. That's the gospel. And we see that here. And actually it's spelled out in such great ways. First of all, here's the most obvious question about Exodus. Does God give them the law first and say to Israel, now if you obey the law, I'll save you from slavery and bring you out of Egypt? Does he say, here's the law, and if you obey it, I'll bring you out? No. He says, I'll bring you out, and then he gives them the law. So you see that for the first, basically, the first 19 chapters of the book of Exodus is God bringing them out, saving them, even though he hasn't even given them the law. And in many, many, many ways, they show themselves grumblers and unhappy and not all admirable people. So what we have is right out of the gate here in the book of Exodus, the principle of grace. God saves you by grace, then changes your life. Not, well, if you change your life and you pull yourself together, then maybe I'll save you. Other religions, you pull yourself together, then I'll save you. Christianity, I'll save you. And then we will renovate your life. And that's very important. The second thing that's most interesting is he brings the people of Israel out and then gives them the law. But the law makes them a people. And in fact, God says over and over in Exodus, I'm going to give you my law so you will be my people and I will be your God. That's relational. That's relational. If you may not know me a bit, but if you heard me say something like my Kathy, and you didn't know my wife was Kathy, you might assume that that's probably who I'm talking about. Because to call someone my Kathy is the language of intimacy. And so here's God saying, I'm going to be in an intimate personal relationship with you. Not only will you be my people, but I will be your God. And what is the purpose of the law then? The purpose of the law is not to save us. But the purpose of the law is not to rack up merit points. The purpose of the law is to have a relationship. The law shows us that this is the kind of God we have. Don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. Why? Because the God you have a relationship with, if we're going to have a relationship, is a God of honesty, is a God of caring, is a God of love. And therefore, it's extraordinarily important for you to see that the role of God's moral law is there for relationship. That's radical. It's just completely radical. So the idea that grace comes first, then obedience, rather than the other way around. And the idea that also it's very important that you see that the law is there. We must obey it, but we obey it in order to have a relationship with God. Those are very, very important things that you only see in the book of Exodus. But the last thing, and this brings us to Jesus, is this. God doesn't just give them the law. He also gives them the tabernacle and the sacrifices. And actually, if you're going to divide Exodus in 3 parts, as I would, the first few chapters are God bringing the people out. Then the middle chapters are the law, and the last chapters are the tabernacle. And why would God say you're going to have the priests, and you're going to have the sacrifices, and you're going to have to be offering those sacrifices to atone for sin? Why doesn't he just give them the law? What's with all the sacrifices? And the answer is, this is pointing forward, that the law will never be enough. Even the law given after grace, even the law given only for relationship purposes, will never live up to it. Never. And therefore, unless there's some way of paying for our sin, unless there's some way of atoning for our failures to obey the law, we are not going to be able to stay in a relationship with a holy God. We cannot be in a relationship with a holy God, and of course now we're going to be talking about Leviticus later on, but you cannot be in a relationship with a holy God unless someone atones for your failures to obey the law, which should be the basis for your relationship. And of course what that means is here we're looking at Jesus. And especially in this way, the original act of deliverance was the Passover. God sent the angel of death into Egypt to kill, to destroy. And he said, however, if you kill a lamb and you spread the blood on the doorposts, then the angel of death will pass over you. And of course, Jesus Christ actually has literally said that his Lord's Supper is a Passover sacrifice. And Paul has delivered us that he's the Passover sacrifice. He is the Lamb of God. All these other lambs that were slaughtered in Passover over the years, they can't atone for sin, but Jesus Christ is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. It's by the way, it's intriguing. I'm just tell you a quick story to end. Yep, I can do that. Charles Spurgeon was a great Baptist preacher, and in the 19th century in London, and he was going to preach at a great big auditorium, and not just an auditorium, but almost a palace. And he was in there testing out. This is in the days before there was a PA system or amplification. So he's testing out the acoustics. And he went there, and there was nobody else. As far as he knows, there was no one else there. No one else there. But what he did was, he decided to test the acoustics by calling out, "Behold the Lamb of God who taketh away the sin of the world." Which is, of course, what John the Baptist said about Jesus. "Behold the Lamb of God that taketh away the sin of the world." And there was actually a workman way high up in the rafters that Spurgeon didn't know about, who didn't go to church, wasn't a Christian, and when he heard that voice coming through, he came under great conviction. He said, "What does that mean?" Something happened in his heart, and he went and studied it and became a Christian later on, came back when he realized it was Spurgeon's voice that he'd heard. It's not little woolly bipeds that can take away the sin of the world. Those Passover lambs point to Jesus, the great Passover lamb. The book of Exodus shows us the gospel of Jesus Christ.
So there you go. Some very great insights, I think. So there's a 10-minute overview of the book of Exodus. Any comments on that? Anything that hit you? You do it all. Well, let me do a quick review of what we did last week, and then we're going to get into today's lesson on end of 17 and then 18 when Jethro comes. Now, not Jethro Clampett. Okay, so we talked about manna quite a bit. Numbers 11 talked about how, it provided food for them for 40 years. And apparently, we can read into it that it was the perfect food. It had all of the nutrients, all of the vitamins, because it said they were basically not sick during that time. Their feet didn't swell. They didn't have pernicious anemia, and so they didn't have sore feet, and were diabetic, and all of those things. So, and of course, remember what manna meant was, what is it? They said, what's this? Some people have kind of discounted it, like it was just growing on some bushes that grow there, but not to feed, 2 million people. I mean, that was a lot of manna. So one of the things that talked about was the manna was put, apparently, somewhat debatable, was put into the Ark of the Covenant of Olin. Now, it had to be special manna at that point, or special blessing, because if you kept it a day later, it would spoil. You get all, they didn't have refrigerators, or and I don't think refrigerators would have helped. It was God was saying, it's going to get maggoty and spoil, so don't do it. People did it anyways. and then they were only supposed to do it 6 days. And then do get twice as much on Friday. Of course, some of them went out Saturday to look anyways. And Moses, he's just going, when will they learn? But it is somewhat debatable whether it was in there or not, or just before the ark. There's different places in the Bible where it talks about, there's the manna, that rod of Aaron that budded, symbol of his authority, and then of course the ark, or the Ten Commandment tablets, which must have been pretty small, like we said. They weren't huge like some of the pictures portray. It was a small font, and God had a sharp finger when he wrote. So the other question is, where is the ark today? I don't think the ark was around during Herod's temple time, which is, and a couple of explanations. One is that godly priests hid it somewhere, or Essenes hid it in some cave somewhere. There's the other one where the son of the Queen of Sheba, who had been fathered by Solomon, he stole it and brought it to Ethiopia. Now, and we talked about Haile Selassie, who was the emperor of Ethiopia. He called himself the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So he traced his ancestry back to Solomon. But there is some videos that show there's some, very secure place is saying the manna was the bread of life. Just like the split rock analogy we talked about, that Jesus was, we're not open to, some weird speculation on what that means. Jesus says, Paul says that Jesus is the rock. And out of that rock came living water, which Jesus promised to those that believed as well. So we're going to get to it later too, but remember, he was to hit the rock. Later, when they were thirsty, he was supposed to speak to the rock, and he hit it. And for us, we think, that was kind of unfair. Here Moses did all this for, 120 years or whatever, and now he's not going. Now, he did make it later, didn't he? On the Mount of Transfiguration. He did come down and talk with Jesus. And I don't think Moses went to heaven and said, this is really unfair. I think who much is given, much is required. He knew a lot, and therefore God expected a lot from him. And it was symbolic. You don't put Christ back on the cross. You don't strike Christ again. And that was the symbolism behind that, why he was supposed to speak to the rock, not hit it again. We talked about that song, which Jesus is a rock. And we talked about that. When I was looking on YouTube for songs, just about every single one of them that I found, they were all in black churches.
But they can sing.
And they can sing, and they can move. I always remember there was, I think it was a black choir at the state fairgrounds during the state fair, or during the county fair. And they were on these rickety stands, and they started moving, and you just thought, oh no, is the whole thing going to fall down? Well, in this place now, the Amalekites attacked. Now they were descendants of Esau, we talked about, and they were very cruel. The Bible indicates in another place too that one of the things they did was the people that were kind of the stragglers, they'd pick them off at the end and kill them. And they were very cruel. They were being descendants of Esau. I think there was always that grudge. Jacob, he ripped our forefather off. And then we talked about the power of prayer. The analogy of Moses lifting up his staff and then Aaron and Hur going on each side of him and holding it up. And the analogy that people get weary in prayer and they need help from other people too. When his arms went down, you're looking down into the valley and the battle shifted. The Amalekites started winning. Put it back up. And now, was that really just dependent on him doing that? God could have just defeated the Amalekites with just, send the angels and they're all done. And then we listened to a little clip by J. Vernon McGee on this whole. So that was kind of what we talked about last time. Now, in the end of Exodus 17, 13 through 14, it says that God was going to wipe out all the remembrance of the Amalekites. Now, maybe some 400 years later, God instructs Saul through Samuel. He says, go fight the Amalekites and do the job. They've been enemies of yours, they're still enemies. And Saul, using worldly wisdom, remember, he said, well, I saved the best. He had that excuse. And Samuel is going, oh, why did I anoint this guy? And he saved Agag, the king, too. And Samuel, who was probably an old man at that point, it's kind of weird, He took a sword. He said, okay, you're not going to do it, I will. Now, ironically, when Saul died on the mountain fighting the Philistines, there was a young man that found him, and he was, on his sword. He couldn't quite, he wanted to kill himself so that the Philistines didn't make sport of him and mutilate him, and he didn't want to be around for that. And this young man came, and he recounts this to David. He says, so I ran him through. And David said, you're coming here thinking you're going to get a reward? No. He says, you touched the Lord's anointed. David was still on Saul's side and Jonathan's side, and he wept, that they, he said, don't publish all of this in Gath, what happened. But he said, well, who are you? What did you think you could do that? Who are you? And he says, I am an Amalekite. The irony of that. So, and some have said that, remember in the book of Esther, Haman, it says he was an Agagite. In other words, he might have been a descendant of that king Agag. So, now according to some researchers too, this place, Rephidim, wasn't the only oasis in the region where they had this battle. And it was situated in the mountains where nomads brought cattle to drink. When the Israelites traveled to Canaan, they discovered the Amalekites who inhabited the northern Sinai Peninsula. So, you can somewhat understand the Amalekites. Here comes the 2 million people with who knows how many cattle and sheep. And we have an oasis here. They're going to drink it all up. That would be one excuse. So it says the Amalekites tried to prevent the Israelites from reaching the oasis. Let's see. So this one guy argues that according to traditional interpretation, a show of hands by Moses was regarded as a sign of prayer. This is significant because the text does not directly mention prayer. Van Cedars, this man, believed that Moses' gesture, like Joshua's elevating the javelin, should be understood as a practice of magic and secondarily religious. So we don't believe that. It wasn't magic. And so So that's about the Amalekites now. Going to chapter 18. So here comes, and we're going to see a little clip of this in a minute. So a family reunion, verses 1 through 4. Why don't we read, somebody read Exodus 1 through 4, 1 through 18, 1 through 4.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
This just occurred to me. When God said that he was going to completely remove the memory of the Amalekites, well, then why did he put it in Scripture? Because now we all know about it. He didn't remove the memory of the Amalekites.
Well,
We
Saul-
all know about it now.
Yeah, he was supposed to. That Saul was supposed to, but it took, I mean, remember the timeline of God too. He says this is going to happen. It doesn't necessarily mean tomorrow.
That's true, but
Yeah, in
but
400
it,
years.
but it,
Yeah.
it's not completely removed from memory.
Yeah,
But it
that's a
also-
good one to ask God.
And it also says in that last, because Moses built the altar and he named it, "The Lord is my banner," and he said, "The Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation." What does that mean?
So, I mean, it's gonna keep going on and
Well,
on.
maybe the nation of the Amalekites is gone. Maybe that's the interpretation, because you don't hear about the Amalekites fighting Israel today. Oh, the Amalekites threw some bombs over to, you know. I mean, we have descendants of,
How many in here has met an Amalekite?
what was that?
How many in here have met an Amalekite?
Yeah,
If
I
we
mean,
didn't
even-
talk about it in the Bible, we wouldn't be there to validate that they're gone.
yeah. And even, you know, all the descendants of Esau, we don't really, they might be interspersed, intermarriage with other groups probably, but they're not a nation anymore. Maybe that's what they meant.
Well, if it
Yeah,
showed
that
up
could
with
be.
Samuel or Saul, then, which was later,
400
that
years later.
we're talking generation to generation, that could be been, yeah, that's one of those generations right down there somewhere.
Yeah. Now, I think where Edom was situated at one time, I think that's the country of Jordan now, that area. But you think back, all of these decisions and how the long-lasting effect of them, of Jacob cheating Esau, and what, the domino effect of that over the years. Or Sarah and Abraham having Ishmael, and the domino effect of that for centuries. Yeah, that's a good point. So let's read 18, 1 through 4. So we have a family reunion here.
Now Jethro, the priest of the Midian and the father-in-law of Moses, heard of everything God had done for Moses and for his people Israel, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. After Moses had sent away his wife Zipporah, his father-in-law Jethro received her and her 2 sons. One son was named Gershom, and for Moses said, "I have become an alien in a foreign land." And the other was named Eleazar, for he said, "My father's God was my helper. He saved me from the sword of Pharaoh."
So, he's good friends with Jethro. He spent 40 years with him. Now, apparently, what's happened here is, remember, Abraham was starting to go back to Egypt. God told him to go back. Remember, he hadn't circumcised his sons. Zipporah was not a happy camper about that. And she ended up doing it. And then she said, "You're a bloody husband to me." The speculation is there's no record of her ever being in Egypt during the plagues.
Yeah, but it does say he took her to Egypt.
Maybe, I know if it says 2 action, I don't know, that's what Jay Vernon said. Yeah, there's no record of, once they're there.
Discussion about this thing, trying to figure it out, where is she? Did she go there? Did she go over here?
I think what some of the guys I read, that she went back then to be with her dad and sisters. It seems in verses 5 through 7, McGee says, it seems odd that Moses is not recorded as being glad to see his sons or wife, only Jethro. Now, Jethro is also known as Ruel and Hodab. Now, it says he was a priest, so he says he recognized now that God is the true God after hearing all that God had done for Israel. But does later return to Midian. He doesn't stay. Moses invites him, why don't you stick around? He says, nah. But he does drop off his 2 sons and Zipporah. And apparently at this point, from then on, they stay together. Now, according to rabbi tradition, Jethro rejected the Midianite religion, which was kind of a fluffy, there's more than one God, there's regional gods, and then was ostracized by the other Midianites. If you remember, other Midianites later in the story of Israel, they fight with them, the country of Midian, but not. Jethro's kind of a separate guy. So, there's something I was going to, I'll wait on that. It's interesting, when he's coming back, he had heard what God had done. How did he hear? He put up his laptop and turned on CNN, Canaanite Network News. But probably the caravans that traveled through, there was a caravan route, and they probably said, hey, Midian, that. Remember Moses, that son-in-law of yours, that good for nothing? Anyways, that's probably how word had spread. It wasn't quick, I'm sure. It was by camel. So, I'd like to show a little clip here. Now, this one probably is going to be copyrighted. So, for those people in the peanut gallery, you're maybe not going to see this. So let me get to... So an interesting little extra biblical portrayal of maybe from conversation, but so now Jethro in verses 8 through 12 of chapter 18. So Jethro is impressed as to what God has done for Israel, and now he knew that Jehovah was the greatest. And then they did a sacrifice together. And that doing a sacrifice was evidence that Jethro had probably came to a true knowledge of, fuller knowledge of Jehovah. Now, some that I read said that Jethro had probably a little skeptical of Moses' plans when he left Midian. When he said, okay, you're going to go. Well, you're 80 years old, I guess. I raised you, gave you wings and roots. Anyways, he was unsure of how it would affect his grandkids and daughter, Zipporah. I know I would have been if a son-in-law said, well, I'm going to go do this. And I'm thinking, well, what about my daughter and the kids? This sounds like a pretty crazy plan. So, but Jethro's advice, obviously he loves Moses. He was well familiar with him. He knew his idiosyncrasies living with him for 40 years. And he was concerned about his physical health, like it was portrayed in that, I thought, pretty well. And You know, giving advice to adult children is not easy, as many of you know. But you know, Moses actually probably embraced it. I know my parents set a good precedent for me. Their philosophy is don't give advice unless asked for, which is probably pretty good. I was talking to Steve about this, and I said I've tried to do that, and sometimes I've had to bite my tongue. Steve agreed, and he says he has scars on his tongue. So this whole idea now of you saying, no, he's doing it all himself, from morning till night, you know. Don't you have anything better to do? You know. And so the advice is, you set up, which is basically our court system.
Yeah.
You know, there's the smaller courts, and then it can work its way up to the Supreme Court, and then they're the final say. Now, on the surface, to me, it seems like a really good advice. You know, you think of pastors where a board will shield them from like too much counseling. Because in a lot of big churches, if that's what they did, they would counsel from early morning till late at night. And they wouldn't have time for other things. So, I mean, a lot of churches will farm that out, you know, to counselors, or have somebody that's, you know, a woman to counsel women, which would be wise. But now some have said it was not good. And J. Vernon McGee, interesting, is one that didn't like this whole plan because it diluted Moses' authority. McGee was saying he thinks this was worldly wisdom. And notice that God wasn't the one that suggested it. Now, it's not to say that God can't use people in authority in our life to give his advice. I think we've all had that experience. But remember, God dealt with Moses face to face. It says he was kind of special. He didn't need a third party to intervene. On the other hand, God didn't tell him not no either. You know, when he agreed to the plan, we don't have it where it's saying, and God took Moses aside and said, don't do this. So that's, and sometimes, you know, perhaps the church today borrows too much worldly wisdom from, you know, business. We're going to run things like a business here. We're going to, you know, do things that aren't necessarily what God would want. So now Jethro's suggestion eventually led to the organization of the Sanhedrin, the 70. 1,500 years later, what did the Sanhedrin do? They crucified Christ. But I still think, it's a good standard as people burn out. And
Do you think there was a point, because Moses was the only one doing this, that he's talking about the long lines of people? Well, some of them were not going to take a while for them to get their dispute worked on. Some of them were little things and some were big things. The fact that it was tiring for him, but they're not going to get through that line very fast.
no.
And try to help that along.
Yeah, you'd think the people would say, hey, okay, number 520, that's me.
Yeah.
Like you're waiting at the license bureau, you know.
Yeah, but it also,
Sorry, closed.
it does say that, so then you don't know, but he said, first of all, he had done a sacrifice. He'd done a burnt offering to the Lord, to God. So you know where his heart is, it's there. And Moses is saying that when he does it, he judges between a man and his neighbor and makes known the statutes of God and his laws. So Jethro knows what Moses is, how he's doing it. But he says, now listen to me, I will give you counsel, and God be with you. You be the people's representative before God, and you bring the disputes to God. You know,
Yeah.
he keeps bringing that up. So, I know he's not.
It was obviously an Herculean effort to try to do that. And so I mean, personally, I kind of disagree with McGee. I know that Gothard also thought the same thing, and I think maybe Gothard got it from J. Vernon McGee, but this is what, in the character sketchbook, it says, Scripture tells us not to walk in the counsel of the wicked, but rather delight in the law of the Lord. But Jethro was not a wicked pagan priest, and the full body of the law had not yet been revealed. Jethro was a priest of Midian, and hence a descendant of Abraham. His other name, Ruel, means friend of God. It seems likely that he was a worshiper of God. Furthermore, Jethro was Moses' father-in-law, whom he had served for 40 years. Jethro was sincerely concerned for Moses' welfare and the welfare of his daughter and his 2 grandkids. He may have been worried that Moses' responsibility would only lead to further marital difficulties. Interesting. Moses was wise in giving attention to the instruction of his father-in-law in order to gain understanding. But he was wrong not to seek the Lord more complete solution, which would have answered Jethro's objections and would have prevented the unnecessary consequences which followed. So the Sanhedrin business is what, so maybe there was a plan B that God could have said, well, you can do that, but still you need to oversee. I don't know. He was supposed to pick men that were godly. You know, it's not like when we vote on judges now, you know, there's this big long list and they're all running unopposed. You have no idea what they're like. You can write in Ken Neal, you know.
Not a good idea.
So, yeah, I think, you know, but it is interesting that I think our founders based our judicial system, made partly on the biblical method here of having lower courts and then higher courts. There's one other thing, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Oh, several years ago, I listened to J. Vernon McGee on the radio, sort of on a regular basis, while he was still living. And somebody had asked him, so what are your plans? Do you plan to somebody else to take over when you no longer can do it? And he said, no way. I'll have my recordings, you can use that. But he didn't trust anybody else to take over his ministry. And I'm thinking that what you said about his viewpoint on Jethro is kind of the same thing. Don't trust anybody else.
Which can be a downfall too.
I would think so.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Big downfall.
Yeah, and you know, some of these big mega churches, the only one they'll trust to take over the ministry is their son. And I think that's always a bad precedent.
Not a good one either.
And I think we can name some churches where that happens. There's one thing before we close I thought was interesting. So whatever happened to Gershom and Eleazar, Moses' sons? Don't hear much about them later on. We hear about Aaron's sons. So in Judges 18, we have a little window. Judges 18, 30 through 31. I think we have time to look it up, but there's a guy named Jonathan. He's the grandson of Moses, the son of Gershom. And what's he doing? He's an apostate priest. This guy says, hey, why don't you be my priest, you know? We serve idols and stuff, but we serve everybody. It's kind of like that. And Jonathan needs a job, apparently. And it doesn't bother him that he's doing this and not serving the Lord. Very sad, isn't it, that a grandson of Moses would be an apostate priest. And any comments on that?
That was Judges 18, you said?
Judges 18, 30 through 31. Just a quick little glimpse there.
There was something else that caught on that, what they were talking about there, the guy said something that hit me, and I thought it was from here, but is appropriate for today, because he's talking about teach them the statutes of the laws and make known of the way in which they are walked and the work they are to do. Teach them this stuff. And he said, you need to obey the laws so that because you have the freedom to not obey them makes you free.
Right. You don't
That was a
need,
good statement.
being a slave, you were used to obeying because you had the whip on your back. He says, yeah, like, that was good, wasn't it? That you need to learn to do it because you're free now and you want to do it.
Yeah, and you're free to not obey, but because you have that freedom, obey the law and then you don't get in trouble.
Right? I mean, this kind of ties into what Keller was saying too. You know, that's the gospel. We're doing the law not for our salvation, but because we are saved. Okay. Well, you have a little story on the back of, from the character sketch book that you can read on your own. Okay, well, thank you for coming, and remember, John right now has his work before the court. So Karen, I saw that somebody did your driveway while you were gone.